So welcome to Lancefield on the Line. My name's David Lancefield. I'm here with Josie Thomson, the multi-award winning coach, author, speaker, cancer survivor, and maverick. Her words, not mine, although I might agree. As I said, the co-author of a fantastic seminal book, The Wise Advocate, The Inner Voice of Strategic Leadership. And also Josie was also a former senior executive of one of the world's largest mining companies. What a fantastic set of life experiences and roles. I wonder what else you've done. Probably you've done everything. But Josie's had a profound impact on me in a small number of interactions. And that's a credit to who you are as a person and your skill. And I'm very grateful for it. And I'm hoping for a little bit of that right now in the next few minutes. Josie, welcome.
Hello, it's good to be here.
Thanks, Josie. So neuroscience I've talked about. You would think in some ways that in knowledge-based organizations where people are hired, retained, rewarded for their brain rather than their brawn, you'd think that neuroscience would have sort of caught on. And you'd also think that it would play a sort of more prominent role. I'm just curious, why is it taken so long? Were they just waiting for your book? But why do you think it's taken so long?
I think they were definitely waiting for the book. I mean, the book makes it understandable. When I came across neuroscience, it was back in 2006, and it was a big word. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew that the way it was framed, it said it had relevance to leadership. So it piqued my interest. So I went to the very first Neuroscience of Leadership Summit in Asolo in Italy. And from the get-go, I was hooked. It created a forum of knowledge that really informed a deeper understanding of why I think the way I think, why people think the way they think, why people behave the way they behave, and more importantly, how can I influence and collaborate with people in my role of leader in a much more effective manner. That's actually more enjoyable as well.
Yes, spending your hours at work more enjoyably. That's a good thing, especially at the moment. Where would you, if you had to generalize, I know every industry and country is different, but where would you say we are in terms of maturity of the application of neuroscience in the business world?
I think we're definitely still in infancy. There's definitely a growing interest in the application of neuroscience. I think in recent years, what I've seen is that neuroscience has become, the languaging of neuroscience has become more palatable for leaders, because it's now taking what could be very complex scientific terms into, well, how do I apply this? What does it mean to me as a leader? And how is that useful? So instead of me talking about the quantum Zeno effect, which I understand what that means from a science perspective, I can say to you, David, the quality and focus of your attention hardwires the way you're thinking right now. So if you're wanting to change your experience, you need to start thinking about what you're thinking about and spend more time on thinking that way to produce the outcomes you actually want, instead of thinking about the outcomes you don't want and attracting the conditions to bring those outcomes forward.
So if we have a greater level of consciousness and appreciation of our brains, and we're more skillful with it, I'd sort of think that you'd perhaps even spend less time working, but you'd do it at a sort of higher quality, and the interactions between people would be better. At a time when there's a lot of talk, especially during the pandemic, of people overworking, not relating that well, mental health being an issue. I'm not saying it solves everything. You'd sort of think it would be a good thing at a number of different levels, at the personal level, the corporate level.
I'll tell you what it does do. It gives you the ability to become a much more conscious leader and creator of your experience, so that when you find yourself feeling triggered by an event or even just a thought or a belief about what's going on around you, you can actually just be still and become the observer of what's going on, that inner narrative, or what we call in the book, the wise advocate, so that you can just observe that thought, that belief, that automatic assumption, and instead of absorbing it, you can, by taking this third person perspective, start to take a look around it and realize that it may not actually be the whole picture, may not be the whole story. Yet some of these stories, beliefs, patterns of thoughts and behavior have been wired into your brain at much younger stages of your development. So for example, you know, there was an executive that I coached a number of years ago who was in a very senior public position. And whenever she was up for awards, because she was amazing, she would always get sick and would never attend these public forums. She eventually would be gifted these awards, but was never actually in the public eye in receiving them. And we had a conversation about this, and I said to her, I'm really curious about this. It sounds like a pattern. And she said, it's definitely a pattern. And I said, well, where did this come from? And she just sat there and she said, I've never really thought about it before. And she just got quiet just for a little while. And then all of a sudden this light bulb moment occurred. And she said, when I was 6 years old, 6 years old, I baked a cake for my dad, and we had the extended family over. And I came out in my Sunday best and presented this cake in front of everybody to my dad. And in front of everyone, he looked at the cake and he looked at me and he said, you've burnt the rim. And he said, I still remember that to this day. And you should have seen her, like physiology. It was like when you recall a memory that has attached to it what's called a social thread, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. You not only relive the story of the memory, you actually relive the felt experience of that memory as if it's happening right now. And so that little girl,
physiological, real.
Completely. It's like trauma. It doesn't get hardwired just in your brain. It gets hardwired in your cells. So when you're needing to work through these things, you actually have to take a really holistic approach. And it's actually not that difficult to do. You just got to know how to do it. So this little girl ran into her room, slammed the door, and decided that day that she was never going to be good enough. Right? And she had this pattern whenever she was in a public space being acknowledged for anything, that this kind of trauma and belief that she was never good enough would come up. So it was extraordinary to see this. And so the little story I made, I'm very creative in the moment. And I happened to have a teapot and a little creamer on my desk. And I said to her, see this little creamer? This is the 6-year-old you. See this teapot? This is you today. I said, you're quite different, right? But the program that's running you is actually coming from this version of you. It's like giving the steering wheel of your car to your 6-year-old. Not wise. So what we need to do is bring her into you and have her realize that it's safe to be you now, and that you're wiser and stronger as a consequence of all of these experiences that you've had. Integrate some of that stuff, let go of stuff and stories that don't belong to you now. And with your wise self, approach these situations with that wisdom and knowledge that you've acquired. And it was a really amazing breakthrough.
That's
for
amazing.
her.
That's incredibly powerful, incredibly creative. No wonder you're multi-award-winning coach. That's but it's interesting. There's a number of themes there, and one of them is around the physiology. Because if you think about some executives that generally, and some I've worked with, when they're going through situations where it's giving a big pitch or a board meeting or taking an award, the solution is often in very much the head, the analytical part of I need to structure my thoughts better, I need to present with more impact. But I'm fascinated with how you, in many of these cases, in that case it was some form of trauma, how you need to look at the whole self, because I don't see as much of that. Tell me a little bit more about that holistic approach, because that feels, it's not novel to you, you do it. But in the rest of the business world, for other people, I don't see that as much. I'm curious.
Well, look, I mean, it was novel to me once upon a time. But once you have an awareness of things that freak you out, and then actually seek to understand it at a deeper level, you're no longer fearful about it. You're no longer freaked out by it. You still get triggered by things, but instead of allowing that triggered response to overwhelm your capacity to think straight and respond carefully or mindfully, you can observe the fact that you're being triggered. You can actually recenter yourself through mindfulness, through the breath, through calming yourself down. And this can happen quite swiftly. And as a consequence of calming down your nervous system, your thought processes become very clear, and therefore your delivery can become very calm and considered instead of reacting, which once you're triggered, if you're not being mindful, you're likely to react instead of respond. And this is why being able to have that circuit breaker in the middle, we've all heard of free will, but we also have this capacity called free won't, which says just because I feel triggered and I really want to tell you where to go, doesn't mean I should. It's not wise, right? But that capacity to put the brakes on your brain's impulse to react requires mindfulness, requires being aware of what's going on without absorbing it, just observing it.
That is incredibly powerful. That's about, being conscious, making choices. And I was thinking about some of the most, if you like, testosterone sort of filled executives who are sort of impatient, probably would have thought, and hear me out before you correct me, because I know what you're going to say, but I think this sort of stuff's a bit soft. I've got targets to hit. I haven't got time for this. This is all a bit, out there. I need to just focus on the targets. Whereas what you were talking about there was, the elements of high performance in the moment, making great decisions. But how do you, I'm sure you've come across a few individuals like that. How do you...
Yeah, all the time. And I just say, well, how's that working for you? Why are we even having this conversation?
Touche.
If there's not, like, all I need is a gap, a small gap of curiosity, and therefore a willingness to try something a little bit different. Different is, like, we don't learn in our comfort zone, David. We only learn when we're in our discomfort zone. So that requires us to do something different. How are we going to learn and grow if we don't get agitated to get out of our comfort zones?
That's so refreshing, because some coaches and consultants sometimes go with this sort of very softly incremental approach. And of course you don't want to bruise people, but having a little bit of that riff and rough, and just sort of grit to try and encourage people to think differently and push to some form of, not necessarily extremes, but push them out of that comfort zone is refreshing, because sometimes it's just a bit too easy, if you like.
It can be done gently. So, a lot of my clients, I get called lots of things. A lot of times I get called the smiling assassin, so I'll be getting spun a story about why something didn't happen or why they didn't attend to something or whatever. And I'll just sit there and smile and nod my head. And then I'll just gently say, well, tell me what really happened.
Yeah, you've done that.
And then all of a sudden it just gently disarms that, that protective part of us that says, I don't want to admit that I was fearful about having that conversation, or I don't want to admit that I wasn't sure about the words to use, But when you have, and what that requires is, and another big buzzword that's being used now is psychological safety. You really have to provide an environment that allows people to feel safe to tell you the truth.
Yes.
Right? Because if they're not being truthful with you, they're probably not being truthful with themselves.
Indeed.
And the thing that really sets us free from our patterns is actually having the courage to be truthful with ourselves about what's really going on. And then having, the capacity to find a coach that you feel fit with, where you know that you can be honest with them and that you do feel safe enough to have these courageous conversations, which really do demonstrate your commitment to excellence and improving the quality of your life and your leadership. That's what it takes. And I mean, it's no secret, but the late Sir John Whitmore, who wrote the book on coaching for performance, I was his coach for 12 years, and I have a testimonial that he wrote for me. And I remember when he wrote, because I never used it, I never told anyone I was his coach, but whenever I went to coaching conferences around the world, he would openly say, and he's my coach, Josie Thomson. And I would just shrink into a corner because I wanted to earn my own stripes. I wanted to earn my own stripes. I wanted to earn my own stripes. And off
Right.
my own efforts. It wasn't because I was Sir John Whitmore's coach,
I see.
and so I
I see.
never ever used it until he passed. And I spent a week with him in the UK a few months before he passed. And he asked me, he said, "You've never actually used it." And I said, "John, I wanted to do it on my own." And he wrote in his testimonial to me, "If anyone deserves to be called a master coach, it's Josie Thomson." And he went into a whole lot of spiel. And he said, even though she's feminine, and I read this and I got a bit triggered.
Outrageous.
And I rang him and I said, "So John, why did you write that?" And he said, "Actually, Josie, it's something that's part of your art." He said that using that femininity, you can go in there and you can talk with the head. You can talk very precisely and quite assertively around the science. He said, but then there's this feminine side that says, "You're safe now. I'm on your side. Now tell me the truth."
Yes.
And it just allows for these brave
That's
conversations to
powerful.
come forward. Yeah. And some of the conversations I had with John were just remarkable. And he's someone that I thought was the guru of gurus. And yet he would have light bulb moments as a consequence of, the questions that I would pose to
Of
him
course.
to think about.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk at the moment, especially sort of during the pandemic, of leaders needing, whatever shape and form they're in, leaders needing to become more compassionate. Some people have talked about wise compassion. I'm curious how, if you've grown up candidly without it, or at least without demonstrating it, and compassion is obviously is action focused more than empathy.
Yeah.
How you sort of grow that capability, that sort of muscle. Where would you start? If somebody came to you now and said, "You know what? I know I need to be compassionate. I'm being flippant here. I've read about it. Oh, I've seen that leader I've admired over there. I don't know really where to start."
Yeah.
Where would you?
Well, first I would check that they actually really want to do it, that they're not just saying it. So there's one, desire and commitment are not the same thing. We have a desire to do many things in life, but we don't necessarily commit to do them. So the first thing I check is, actually, are you really wanting to do this? And why is that important to you? So if the why isn't big enough, you aren't going to do it. Don't waste my time or your money, right? So that's the first thing I check in. And then understanding, well, what does it mean to you? What does compassion mean and why is that important? Because sometimes there's association with our interpretation of what that word means. And if you think it's weak, why would you want to do that? But when maybe there's a flaw or there's a gap in your understanding of what it means, or there's a gap in your understanding of the profound benefits that it could deliver you, then all of a sudden the willingness and the openness to try something new appears. And when that appears, then there's less resistance. So there's a bit of pre-work.
No, I understand that. I love that you're focused throughout this conversation and throughout your work on the sort of, why does it matter? Why does it matter to you? Sort of, whatever term you use, impact, value, materiality, it's sort of real. It doesn't have to just be money, but it could be, does this matter to me as an individual before you actually get into the work? The one thing that I'm now talking about you, I mean, these conversations are deeper than the average business conversation, whatever that is, but they are about the head, heart, soul, the being. You will delve into, or you will encourage people to think more deeply about themselves. And some of these people, I imagine, will have not done that maybe ever before. I've certainly come across executives who typically through some form of negative event have suddenly started thinking afresh about the meaning of life, the meaning of themselves, and so on.
Yeah.
How do you look after yourself in that process? Because you're fully invested, right? But how do you protect yourself in those situations?
Well, I'm really clear about my role and that I'm there to serve. So I'm really just a conduit to the betterment of this person's life. So I can listen to I'm a very, very deep listener. So I don't just hear what you say, I hear what you're not saying. And I'm also very trusting of my own intuition. So if I get a sense about something, I'll say, "So David, I'm getting a sense that there's something more to that. What do you think?" So I'll just gently probe.
Yes.
And no matter what comes forward, and I've heard some fairly traumatic detail of different things that have occurred in people's lifetimes. And, you know, what I'm actually very, very good at is from the outset, creating a space of absolute trust and safety. And that's got to be there. And you have to be explicit about that setup. Once that's set up, then slowly, the person can start to unfurl and reveal their deeper sense of selves. And the conversations we end up having are conversations they've always wanted to have, but never known where to go and have them in a safe space where they were not going to be judged or rejected or anything like that. So for me, how do I protect myself? I don't feel like I need to protect myself for anything, because I see myself as being there as a servant.
You're clear on your role. Clear on your
Absolutely. And I'm very clear on my boundaries as well.
Yes.
So I'm very clear that when I'm coaching, I'm coaching. But if I hear you, like, because of my experience with cancer, and I'm very direct with people, you know, if there's something they come to me. So there was a very senior leader that was diagnosed with cancer a number of years ago. And she came to me and she was given 8 weeks to live. And she said, Josie, I've seen you around for years and I've always wanted to talk to you, but I never thought it was the right time. And I was always a bit intimidated by you.
Right.
And she said, but I need to talk to you. And I said, well, come talk to me. So we sat down and I said, okay, so how may I serve you? Right? It's not about help. How may I serve you?
Yes.
And she said, well, you know, I have young kids. I'm in a senior, you know, executive role. I've been diagnosed with cancer. I've got 8 weeks to live. And I said, yes, and? So that's story. I said, so why are you here? And so she said, well, I don't want to die. And I said, well, we're all going to die. I said, what do you want? So this is the thing that I was going to mention before with the brain, and why neuroscience is so critical for leaders to actually have a fundamental, basic understanding about. So if this is our brain, right? So that's only as big as our fist. If we were to cut it open, which I won't recommend you do, but at the front of the brain, which is just at the front of your head here, is what's called the prefrontal cortex. When you're making decisions, when you're driving your life forward, when you're focusing on what you want, you're actually in the front seat of your brain, right? And when you're in the front seat of your brain, you have the capacity to be more open-minded, to be creative, to be innovative, to problem solve effectively, to think relatively clearly, to recall information, to learn new information, and the braking system can be enabled. However, when things occur in life, that puts you in what's called a threat state, where you're kind of looking behind you and going, oh crap, I don't want that, I don't want that, I don't want that, I don't want that. You jump into the back seat or the boot, right? And when you're in the boot or the back seat, you're not actually going to effectively be able to drive. So it's kind of like saying, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want this, but I do want this. But I'm focusing on what I don't want. So what this person was doing is, I don't want to die, I don't want to die, I don't want to die. And while she was busy focusing on not dying, what was she not focusing on? Living.
Yes.
Right. So oftentimes a lot of people are not aware of what they're focusing their attention on. And when you're focusing your attention on what you don't want, you're priming the conditions to attract the very thing you don't want.
Indeed.
So the very first thing I had to do with this client, and I do with every client, is it's very, very easy to articulate what we don't want, because it's our default system. We're born to know what we don't want. But we've got to kind of work really hard to get into that front seat and take charge of this thing called the brain, right? And teenagers have a really tough time of it because they don't have that fully developed prefrontal cortex until their mid to late 20s. But you and I don't have an excuse. We actually know better, right? So we can either react on these compulsions and impulses, or we can observe and then choose to step into that front seat and say, well, what do I want? If I don't want to react, thank you, brain, for telling me I don't want to react. But what is it that I do want? So get into the driver's seat. And all of a sudden, when you're focusing on what you want, you become more resourceful. right? There's a lot more options available to you than just that, the reaction, right? So with this client, I said to her, look, we're all going to die. So I'm not going to guarantee you're not going to die. That's not going to happen. I said, but what do you want? And so we came up with a series of goals that were very realistic. And hers was to really position herself for the greatest possibility for a radical remission. And I said to her, well, I don't even know if that's possible, but we can definitely get into a position where you're doing all the right things and being held accountable to maximize that. So anyway, we got it past 18 months.
Wow.
And the doctors were like, and the only reason that she had a rapid decline at the end was she went overseas with her family. She said, I really want to go overseas with my family, you know, and have a good time, you know, before I die. And I said, well, do it. And the doctor said, no, you shouldn't go. And I said, I think you should. Take all your meds, be mindful of where the hospitals are, you know. I said, but keep up the good work. So we've done a lot of modifications to her lifestyle to really improve, conditions. But when she went over there, she started drinking and having gelatos and posting all these photos of all these things that she was doing. And I'm looking at it going, I was having anxiety over here watching all of this, thinking she's abandoned the plan, you know. And she came back and within weeks she was gone, you know.
No, that's remarkable.
So, you know, I am as committed to the goals as my clients become. And I am very committed to my clients. So it's pretty tough when things like that happen, because then I experience something called survivor guilt, because it's like people with lesser cancers are dying and I'm still here. It's like, seriously, you know, maybe that Billy Joel song, Only the Good Die Young, you know, I've got some more lyrics to do.
You a couple of times you talked about, if you like, the starting point for your work around how do you give people the you know, the space, give them a sense of trust and obviously psychological safety to express themselves. You talked about listening in all of its shapes and forms, but I'm curious what else you would do. One, because I'm always keen to learn, but also because these terms are bandied around a lot, and you know, oh, I've created a safe space and a great trusting bond, and you sort of say, well, okay, so what practically have you done? What do you do? And it gets a bit fuzzy. So I'm just curious as to how you create that space, because that's the foundation. That's the foundation for the relationship, the work, the outcomes you pursue.
So the very first meeting I have with someone that I haven't met before, the very first thing I say after hello, you know, is, okay, let me get a couple of things really straight with you. First of all, whatever you say is between you and I. If you want to talk about it with anyone else, you can, but I won't be. Secondly, I'm not here to judge you in any way, shape or form. So you need to feel safe enough to put whatever is real for you on the table, because what you keep is, you know, you're only going to get out of this conversation compared to, you know, in alignment with what you're prepared to put on the table. So I say that up front and people get it, you know, and I'm like, right, okay, so let's get started. So the formality's done. They feel like they don't have to be protective or defensive.
It's pretty clear, right? It's a pretty clear mandate.
Explicit.
Very no misunderstandings.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Another term as well as compassion we talked about a lot over the last few months in particular has been resilience in all of its forms. Strategically, resilience for an organization, the organizational resilience, and obviously the individual. And I think for the first time, and you'll no doubt correct me as I say this, I think it's the first time I can remember where we've seen the broader definition of resilience being used at the same time. I can remember times post the banking crisis and before where we talked a lot about, you know, systemic resilience or a company, or at times sort of personal, but we are now talking about it sort of in the round and understanding the relationships, the interactions with the people. What would be on your sort of, you know, in your mandate, you know, around resilience? Because I know you practiced a lot of it, you advise people, you've published a lot on that topic. If you were sort of a new CEO in an organization, you sort of get it, that you have to be more resilient across all those dimensions. What would be the sort of nuggets, the ideas that you'd put in her or his
toolkit.
Attention. Yeah, toolkit.
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, understanding what it actually means is firstly really critical, because it's not about bouncing back. People often talk about resilience as bouncing back. It's actually, you can't go back to whatever you were before something happened. It's about bouncing forward. And so what is it that allows you to transform adversity into stepping stones, right? For your growth, for your strengthening, for your future.
Yes.
And so there are a number of really practical things that you can do to grow resilience. The first thing is labeling what's going on. So whatever you're feeling, oftentimes we get this, charge in our body, but we don't spend the time to actually identify, what is that I feel? I feel angry, I feel frustrated, I feel frightened. Just name it. But the key there is, there's a difference between labeling your emotions versus ruminating. If I label, it means I'm just naming what I feel. But if I ruminate, I'm telling the story about what I feel and why, and that amplifies it. You don't want to do that. You just name it. Okay, so right now I'm feeling charged. The second thing we do is actually look at the situation from a number of different angles. So we reframe or reappraise.
Yes.
So your initial assessment about what's going on is based on the data points that you're focusing your attention on. And therefore the story that your brain's making up about what you're focusing your attention on. But that's not the whole story. If you actually step back and look at it from different angles, all of a sudden you start to think and see things a bit differently, right? And one effective way of doing it is to think about someone that you know and trust and respect, and think about, how would that person respond in this situation, or how would that person view this? And that gives you another angle. Another strategy for building resilience is something called distance. So when you're being triggered, if it's a small trigger, just go and have a glass of water, go and look out the window and appreciate something. Phone a friend, take a walk, do something to distract you and get you away from the trigger just for a short time. So you have time to, what my kids call, calm your farm. And then you can come back and respond. But if it's a big trigger, and they're the ones like, you'll be reading an email, and as you're reading it, you can just feel your blood coming up to the surface, and you start typing back a response, you might just want to press save instead of send.
Take your hands from the keyboard. Take your hands off the keyboard. But it's interesting that taking some space. If I think about, I spend a lot of time in, as I'm sure you have, in different, in your corporate role and in board meetings and executive code meetings, where there are moments where either it's going down the wrong alley, people are getting heated, and you sort of think, if you either reframed it in the way you described, different angles and so on, or you actually just took literally 2 or 3 minutes, stood up, go for a walk, get a glass of water, the quality of decisions that would be made and the quality of relationship that could be sustained would be remarkably different. But it's all that, there's a sort of, why would you do that in the intensity? There's a sort of sense of you're breaking out, you're weak if you need a break, whereas actually you're more likely to deliver a better outcome if you do.
I think what happens is you go into a meeting, you realize there's discord, people aren't agreeing, and we don't really talk about what's going on. It's in those moments that we need to just pause and go, hey, David, I just noticed a bit of a reaction in you. What did you just hear me say?
Yes.
Which is different to what did I say? What did you hear me say? Because your brain's going to interpret what I say in your own way.
Yes.
So that gives us the capacity to clarify straight away in the moment and to move forward in a refreshed way. Don't ignore those moments. They're great moments to understand, what did you just hear me say? Because I'm sensing a bit of a reaction here. Well, you just told me I'm an idiot because I didn't do what you expected. Well, actually, no, what I meant was, and so you've got this opportunity to recalibrate and reframe that interpretation.
And that calling it out and interpreting, as you say, is highly skillful. Takes some courage, depending on the relationships you have with the people in the room, but often gets either people don't do it, or it can get very personal very quickly, or you just, as you say, skate over it because you're focusing on the substance of the question or the analysis or whatever it is.
And I think sometimes people get so self-conscious. Oh my gosh, if I call this out, what are they going to think? And it's like, I remind people is that you're in your role for a purpose, and your purpose is to serve something bigger than yourself. So it's actually not about you. Get over yourself and get intentional with what you're there to serve. Yeah. And so when you're clear about that, the fear starts to dissipate, because it's not about you. You know, it's about what you're there to serve. Yeah. And so, going back to mindfulness, one of the most remarkable ways to build it is definitely mindfulness. Yes. And there's mindfulness and there's mindfulness, and that's why every Monday I have a free 15-minute practice that I personally facilitate online to the planet, so that people can just dip their toes, get an experience of it. It's different every week. And they can just try it on and realize it's maybe not as scary as they think.
Yeah, what a great opportunity. So drawing to a close, although I'd love to speak for hours, you are too busy and important for me to do that. And I'll get that sort of assassin look that you've given me before. What are you, in terms of looking at your practice at the moment, there's two questions actually. What are you most excited about? And secondly, if you look at 2021, what are you most hopeful for?
I will answer the second question first.
You may.
And what I'm most excited for in the new year is a greater sense of unity and sustainability. I think COVID's given us forced time out in our rooms, and we've had to really reprioritize. And we've reprioritized work around our lives, not the other way around anymore.
Yes.
So, and I think it's also given us a heightened awareness of the importance of community. And that's why I say unity and sustainable practice. That's what I'm excited about. With my business, I'm really looking forward to even deeper conversations with people, because it's only been in the last month that all of a sudden people have contacted me and said, I'm ready to see you. It's like, I think they've been thinking about it for a long time, and for whatever reason, they've either, not been ready, didn't see the relevance for it. They know and are familiar with my work, and it's like, actually it's time, and they're ready to be brave. And I say, bring it on.
Fantastic. Josie, that was an enriching, stimulating, and very, very powerful conversation. I look forward to more. Thank you ever so much. And that was another edition of Lancefield on the Line.